Awesome, and it's 5 o'clock, so we'll get started. Hi everyone, I'm Anna Marquise, Civic Engagement Coordinator, and welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. That's never been more important than it is right now. I'd like to hand things over to Chris Merrill, ESPC's Executive Director, to talk a little bit more about our work, give an overview of housekeeping, and introduce today's panelist.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks to our panelists and viewers for joining us today. We're excited to get started. We have a lot of people who've tuned in to watch, and so all attendees are automatically muted. We will be posting some resources in the chat feature, and we'd love for those watching to post any questions you might have in the chat. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We can't always get to all of them. And if you are viewing, you have any tech issues, just chat directly to Anna, the host, and she'll try to help you out. So our topic for today is keeping it local, why small town journalism matters to democracy. And I think it should be a lively and informative conversation. I'd like to introduce our panelists first. Tennessee Watson is a reporter at Wyoming Public Radio, where she covers education, youth well-being, and criminal justice. In 2020, Watson was awarded the Abrams Nieman Fellow for Local Investigative Journalism. After a year at Harvard as a Nieman Fellow, she's back reporting on what's behind Wyoming's high juvenile incarceration rates. Welcome, Tennessee.
Hey, everybody.
Mara Abbott is an Olympic athlete turned journalist. She's currently the energy and natural resources reporter at the Buffalo Bulletin in Buffalo, Wyoming. Her work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, ESPNW, the Colorado Independent, Runner's World, Westword, and the Daily Camera, among others. As a professional cyclist, she was a two-time U.S. national champion, two-time winner of the women's Giro d'Italia, and placed fourth in the road race at the 2016 Olympic Games. Welcome, Mara. Adam Meyer began working at the Jackson Hole News and Guide, fresh out of the University of Minnesota's journalism program. Now associate publisher at the News and Guide and vice president of Teton Media Works, Adam works with his team to serve readers with local news and information and to offer advertisers access to highly engaged print and digital audiences. Adam currently serves as the board chair of the Jackson Hole Chamber of Commerce and is an avid outdoorsman. Welcome, Adam. And Nick Reynolds is the State House reporter for the Casper Star Tribune and the vice chair of the in-house media union, the Casper News Guild. A native of upstate New York, he's a 7-year veteran of the newspaper industry and has won numerous statewide journalism awards for environmental and political reporting. Welcome, Nick. And our final panelist is Katie Klingsporn. She is the managing editor of Wildfile, a Lander native. She graduated from the University of Montana School of Journalism and spent the next dozen years working in newspapers in the West, including a 9-year stint at the Daily Planet in Telluride, Colorado. Her freelance work has appeared in publications such as National Geographic Adventure, Adventure Journal, 5280 Magazine, and The Cleanest Line. And she has managed content for the documentary film festivals, Mountain Film and EarthX. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's dive right in. And this first question has a big preamble, but I think it's worthwhile just to kind of frame the entire discussion. So the mission of the Equality State Policy Center is to ensure fair elections, transparent government, and thriving communities. We see these as the fundamental pillars of a viable democracy. Journalism, as I see it, in-depth reporting on issues and information that affect our everyday lives, but that the public might not be aware of or have access to otherwise, acts as a kind of essential lighting system inside our collective institutions. What the founders did with the First Amendment of the US Constitution was, in a sense, to flip that light switch on. And there's still a lot of shadowy corners and dark cellars, whatever. But the First Amendment which guarantees the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, empowers journalists to explore these places, bring their own headlamps, whatever. But the First Amendment empowers us to see what's going on. In an era when trust in journalists and the news they publish has been eroded, undermined, and continues to be under attack, I think it's important to remind people about the role that journalists have played throughout this nation's history. Journalists serve as a bridge between those in positions of power and the people, and they let us know when people have broken the law and or abused power. They're interpreters and synthesizers of complex information, and journalists are also quite often a whistleblower's only chance to have a voice and to correct an injustice. As such, I'd argue that journalism is not only essential to ESPC's mission, but central to the American experiment itself. It's one of the institutions that helps make this whole thing possible. I'd love to hear, panelists, your thoughts on this statement. Do you agree? Am I overstating the role of journalism? Am I missing something important? And let's hear from Katie Klingsporn first. And then I'd love for others to chime in if you want.
All right, well, thanks, Chris. I would say yes is the short answer to that long preamble. I agree, and I think you covered the whys pretty well. So I would just echo everything you said. And I guess I would add that in the modern era, you know, we're flooded with so much content, and with social media, it feels to me that context and nuances so often goes by the wayside, gets collapsed in a sense. So I think that's part of what is driving the divisiveness we're seeing right now. So I think the job of journalists is more important than ever. And by that, I mean the job of being fair and impartial and parsing out complexities so that people understand the issues affecting them and that those issues are not always black and white. So the responsibility is huge. And I also want to point out that the work that goes into that kind of comprehensive, thorough journalism is really hard. It can be really painstaking and boring and definitely not at all sexy. And it's all the harder in small town papers in today's media landscape, where newsrooms are just a shadow of what they once were. So yes, journalists, the good ones, are total heroes.
Anybody else want to chime in on this one?
I'll chime in.
Great. Tennessee.
I mean, I like the lofty goals of, you know, the idea of the whistleblower who comes forward and then there's sort of a, you know, systemic change that takes place. But I also think about the fact that power holds on to power and can abuse it by sort of convincing that individuals who are experiencing harm that it's their fault or that they're potentially the only one. And so I think, you know, another part of journalism and local journalism is saying to folks who feel alone in the experiences that they're having, that they're actually not alone, and connecting them to their neighbors right there in their own community or across the state. And that might not catalyze a convoy of people to the state house to change laws, but it might make them feel more empowered advocating for themselves at the next school board meeting, or going to see a principal in a school, or a county commissioner, or a police officer. So it's those, I think it also works at that scale as well.
Those are great points. Anyone else want to add to this? Nick?
Well, yeah, like thinking about this subject kind of coming in, I mean, I thought a lot about, you know, the type of role that I kind of see myself playing in journalism, so to speak. I mean, when we look at what newspapers used to be for a lot of people, especially like traditional ones like the Casper Star, I mean, we were, you know, sort of omnipresent, you know, it was, there was kind of this expectation that we would cover everything. And if there was a story that needed to be told, people would just come to us, you know? And I think as the ecosystem has expanded the way that it has to social media and all of these other outlets, and people could just send an email. I think the types of stories that can be really impactful ultimately come from a person's relationship with that journalist and that journalist's ability to cultivate those relationships on their own. For me personally, scoops don't fall in my lap. I don't get an envelope of, secret documents to parse through every day. It happens sometimes. Sometimes I just get like weird drawings from people, but sometimes I actually get a trove of documents. But for the most part, a lot of my stories really come from the relationships I've already cultivated with sources. I actually estimate probably 25% of my week at any given time is spent on the phone with sources, and out of those conversations, I would say a small fraction of that actually makes it into print. The things we talk about might turn into other stories. They might turn into connections to other people that I need to make an impression on and convince them that I'm not going to mess their story up, or that I'm going to tell it the right way. And those discussions, ultimately build an understanding of, not only what type of person I am, but what type of work I do. And I think that's an important role for reporters too. Young people come to the industry and think that, they're going to come in like Bob Woodward and be attack dogs. And while there's a part of the job that does require that, it's a much more gentle touch at times. And that's something that does come with experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then the other thing too is just like that I didn't mention is just, traditionally there's a lot of boring stuff too. And Katie mentioned this, but traditionally the local papers would be covering the city councils, the county commissions, the zoning boards, hospital boards, rotaries, cops and courts, local business, the environment, legislative committees, legislature itself, all the various government departments and all that. And there's a lot of like meetings to sit through, and it's not glamorous work, but it's pretty darn essential. Let's move on to the next question. I'd love to hear from Tennessee Watson first, and then from others. Tennessee, so looking specifically at Wyoming, we have a small population and we're spread across a huge geographic area. We're basically like a collection of small towns, widely dispersed. We don't have some big city population center. So what do you see as the role of local journalism in this unique setting? And I guess a related question to this is, why has Wyoming Public Radio worked so hard to reach so many parts of the state, even if expanding the reach at a given time has meant reaching only like a few dozen or a few hundred people more?
So I can't really speak to Wyoming Public Radio's effort to bring our signal to over 90% of the state just because that predates me, but I can sort of speak to how the years of hard work to get that signal out so far benefits me as a reporter. And I think about this in terms of local journalism, hyper-local, being able to look at what's happening in small towns. And as you mentioned, county commissioner meetings and school board meetings, but then also, taking a statewide approach. So that's like one thing that I think about, that blend. And then, I also think about the strong culture of local control. And as a reporter, because there is such a strong culture of local control, a lot of times I can't refer to sort of whatever the statewide policy is, because the state's going to tell me, well, it's up to the county. So when decisions are happening in education or juvenile justice, that's the district level, that's the county level. And I use those as examples because they're the beats that I cover. But I think what I've found is that what one county struggles with, another county within Wyoming is a little bit further down the path of mitigating that or solving that problem. And so working for a statewide news outlet that's still very locally focused, it creates this amazing container for reporting that helps to connect problems to solutions. And each Wyoming community is unique, but they're also facing similar challenges. But I do think that solutions are sometimes better received when they're coming from places that sort of look like you. And so I like being able to sort of see something happening in one place, cover that in that community, but then always ask the question, well, where else is this happening? And how are those communities responding? And there's an idea from the Solutions Journalism Network that, has become sort of a credo for me that I wanted to share, which is just that when you look at solutions, it can heighten accountability by reporting on where and how people are doing better against a problem. And then that removes excuses and it sets a bar for what citizens should expect from institutions or governments. So it's by saying like, all right, you're not solving the problem here, but it's not impossible because they are. Like, that's kind of a unique style of accountability reporting. And I think that it's really amazing to be able to find those solutions within this state. And just to wrap it up, to work for a news outlet that sort of expects me as a reporter to think locally and sort of statewide in that way.
Great. Any other panelists want to weigh in on this point?
I can weigh in on that one. I think, working for a paper that strives to be really hyper local, I feel like it also gives me the responsibility of being able to take issues or incidents outside of our community, because being located where we are, we have so much space around us. And I think that it's not even that we're isolated, but more insulated from a lot of the rest of the world. And so being able to provide that context and being able to not just sort of try to cover the whole state, but to try to say, for this small community, if I look at all the things that are happening out there, whether that's in the state or in the world, what can I bring into focus for my community? And why are those things going to matter here? And who are they mattering to, in a way that makes all of that noise of news, whether we're talking about social media or all the different opportunities we have to consume news right now, what should matter to the people in my town and what do they need to know?
Great. So let's move into the problem here. And then once we establish what that is, then we'll talk about maybe some potential solutions. So a major PEN America study from 2019 concluded that, I quote, and remember this quote, or what it means: as local journalism declines, government officials conduct themselves with less integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and corporate malfeasance goes unchecked. With the loss of local news, citizens are less likely to vote, less politically informed, and less likely to run for office, end quote. So here in Wyoming, there were, by my rough estimate, at least 10 times as many full-time journalists working and reporting daily 20 years ago as there are today. If local newspapers still exist, they're often just shells of their former selves. So the Casper Star-Tribune, for example, just an example, had just under 40 full-time staff in the newsroom in 2000. They had a state desk, which had an editor and a team of reporters and bureaus spread around the state. The city desk had 5 full-time reporters and an editor. They had an investigative reporter who would do things like read all the court filings throughout the state. They had a Washington, D.C. bureau, etc. All the things a statewide paper used to have. Dan Neal, who was the editor at the time, said at the end of his tenure, they had 37 people, and I quote, "We still could not cover all the news," end quote. Today, this same newspaper is down to 4 full-time reporters. Nick, you work at the Casper Star-Tribune today. I'd like to hear from you first. And then I'd love to hear Mara's perspective. Nick, what do you think about the PEN America study I mentioned and its conclusions?
I think the conclusions of that, are a direct result of people no longer performing what are really the 2 key functions of a news outlet. And, that's, 1, to bear witness, and 2, to help people be reflected in the stories that are being told about their community. People want to be a part of the conversation, and the fewer people they actually see reflected in that, the fewer people speak up. As Tennessee was saying, if people don't feel emboldened to share their experience because they don't see that, whether it's with the government or whether that's with each other. And the current pandemic, as we've seen here, we just experienced a layoff yesterday, and we've had a shrinking newsroom due to attrition throughout this crisis. But the economic crisis really exacerbated the collapse in the industry that began in the wake of the Great Recession. That's where a lot of this began. And in the last 2 years alone, in our newsroom, We Enterprises limited 5 positions, with a 6th, our arts and entertainment reporter, ended this week via layoffs. And as you mentioned in yours, we actually have less manpower covering our community and state than we had committed just to the city of Casper 20 years ago. And that decline inevitably causes you to miss some things, and we're going to miss even more going forward. But with that, you lose something even bigger. And to me, that's your entire view of newsworthiness as well. Like with less manpower and less newsroom diversity, that fundamentally changes. Like one example I can name is agriculture. I think the state's farmers and ranchers are going through a serious pinch right now, and it's an extremely complicated situation with a lot of nuance. And I'd wager a large contingent of the public is really unaware of the dynamics that are kind of inherent in that industry. It's something that I personally want to dive into, but the thing about journalism is it's a constant education. And if you want to dive into a topic and you know nothing about, you really have to immerse yourself in that subject to build a coherent understanding of it. I mean, that's good journalism. You need to build sources, you need to understand what you're talking about, and you need to be able to articulate the problems at their very base level and give people a better understanding of what that was, what the problem is than they had before. And with so few people on staff now, I can't just dive into that now. I mean, I have to take all of these seriously. I have to ask myself, do I have the time and capacity to write this story the way it needs to be written? Do I drop everything that's happening in the world to engage in a passion project of mine? Or do I just go half in on all my other stories to give myself the time I need to address that and maybe not even do as good of a job? With limited bandwidth, you inevitably find yourself creating a hierarchy of, what is newsworthy, what's important, and what is not. And at some point, you could get away with that. You could, set yourself a hierarchy of newsworthiness that will lead to an informed public and leave you maybe approaching stories with more intentionality. But as numbers get lower, I mean, the only casualty in that scenario are equally important stories.
You saying that reminded me of another thing that former editor Dan Neal said to me when I was talking to him earlier this week. Not only are we looking at the loss of the capacity, like you just described, to cover basic things and the kind of the decisions you need to make to prioritize. He described, so that room behind you, Nick, there, the newsroom, imagine used to have 40 people in there, all working to put out the news every day. He described that as like an intellectual furnace. And he said that the fewer people that you have, the less heat there is. And his point there was, there were men and women in that room that conservative, liberal, in between, different life experiences from different places. They would challenge each other, and they would be their own worst critics, in-house. And that's another piece that's lost when you reduce reporting capacity in your newsroom. At least that was his point. Any thoughts on that, panelists?
I mean, you raise a really interesting point there, and I think, tying with that, you also got to talk about, who's actually being in newsrooms now. I mean, when you have that intellectual furnace, ultimately, the narratives and just conversation that result from that, really come from a diversity of experiences. And as the numbers get lower and lower, journalism pay gets less and less. We're talking a really competitive industry here. And what's the willingness of editors to take a chance on a diverse candidate pool? I mean, I saw something recently that said 65% of the most prestigious intern positions in the country all came from the same list of prestigious universities. And when you have that frame of, I guess when you have a worldview that sort of comes from this high level of academia, sure, you might be getting accomplished people with great degrees, great training, but you might be missing out on lived experience that really contributes to I guess like a really balanced view of, you know, the world and the challenges that people face navigating that. And yeah, that's something to keep in mind. You know, I remember, I won't name names, but I was talking to a top editor at a, you know, national publication, and, you know, we were talking about that, and, you know, like the, I guess, dearth of like average people in American newsrooms. And, you know, I asked if that was ever a concern, and, you know, she responded to me like, yeah, sure, but it's about good journalism too. And I guess, like, you know, when you ask that question, I mean, are you just like go right away deferring to someone with a degree from Northwestern over someone who, you know, may have gone to, you know, like a state school? I mean, that's a real question.
Adam, it looked like you want to chime in here too.
Yeah, I was going to just add that when newsrooms shrink, I mean, when you think about the type of quality of individual that wants to be a reporter, you have to be incredibly curious, very motivated, very independent. I mean, the characteristics of a successful journalist are really incredible. So when you think about how that skill set can play well in other industries, I think journalism is offering a less compelling path than maybe it once did. So that's a concern. Another element that I think about, you know, we're the only newspaper in the state that has an environmental beat reporter, to my knowledge, solely environmental. I know, Mara, you're covering that as well. And so I was just talking with him, Mike Koshmerl, about how it's taken him years and years and years to break through this PIO blockade to reach access that he's been seeking. And, you know, it's hard. It's hard work. I mean, we have to like to suffer, right, in this industry. I mean, Mara's a professional sufferer prior to being a now different kind of professional sufferer, but cyclists suffer harder than anyone. But I'm always amazed when I see how resilient newsroom staff can be. So to Nick's point, I mean, I think you do lose, you know, as things decline, it does kind of leave last people standing to fill in gaps that have either never been filled or haven't been filled in a long time. And it's hard work. So one thing I would add to the conversation about newsroom shrinking is that the way we haven't really gone into the business model stuff yet, but I think one of the key elements through supporting local journalism, which is the only category of journalism that's really found success. I mean, obviously the big national outlets do good work, but people care about what happened down the street last week. People care about what's happening at the school. People care about what's happening in, you know, the town government. And that's what makes all of, you know, these small community reporters relevant. And so that relevant news has faced this business challenge because we don't have the same depth of revenue streams that we once did in this industry. And unfortunately, the digital side of revenue just does not meet anywhere close to where print used to be. And so I think, to the point of the Casper Star, it's decreased significantly. I know that some newsrooms like ours had to make some difficult decisions this year in eliminating a beat reporter, and that's just related to some of the current economic realities. But I'd like to think we can make it through this crazy time of COVID and the global pandemic impact on business, because I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks, Adam. Katie, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what everyone else has said and point out that I think another thing that's really valuable to newsrooms is institutional knowledge. And, you know, back in the era, like when there were 40 reporters at the Star Tribune, and people did this as a career, and people spent decades in newsroom. They built up all this really valuable institutional knowledge about whatever their coverage area is. And, you know, now it's just more of churning through people. There's more of a burnout function there. And you get people who just don't know, they don't have the relationships with their sources. They don't know the long, sometimes complicated history, and they can miss out on a lot of the nuances and sort of hit their readers the wrong way. That's all.
So, you know, we'll get into this a little more, but there are a lot of responses to this reality, and one of them is Report for America. And so, Mara, can you talk a little bit about Report for America? You know, your experience doing that and how that model of funding journalists fits into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Report for America is how I very fortunately found my way to Buffalo and to Wyoming. And the way Report for America works is Report for America as an organization partners with newsrooms that are seeking to fill a coverage gap. So these gaps that people are talking about when you have to drop a beat reporter, when you aren't able to have that dedicated environment reporter, when you've got a gap in your community that you know is critical to cover, whether that's health, whether that's religion, whether that's schools. These newsrooms partner with Report for America, and Report for America, through its fundraising efforts, supports initially half the reporter's salary. And so they're able to connect newsrooms with these reporters in a way that becomes affordable for the newsroom once again, and also provides an opportunity, I think, to connect reporters who are passionate about doing this kind of work with newsrooms where they're going to be doing work that's genuinely needed, that they're going to the position where the newsroom said, if I could pick one thing, this would be the thing that I would pick. And that's a really special opportunity, both for the newspaper to be able to bring in someone to fill a gap that's so critical for them, and for the reporter to be able to go to a place where their skills are really wanted and they're going to have an opportunity to grow. So it's been great to be a part of that. And it's also challenging because I mean, in a lot of places, you're coming in as a reporter to a beat that hasn't been covered in the past. So I know that there have been a lot of people who have had to work really hard to rebuild that institutional knowledge and to find those connections and to find those sources, because it's just not something that's been there in the past. So my experience has been fairly positive with that. And it's been, you know, I feel really fortunate to have been able to land in a community that I've come to care about so much, and to be able to write about stuff that I find absolutely fascinating. And that was possible because Report for America was able to make that connection. I think it also, you know, the Bulletin got a second Report for America core member, they call us, this year, who's a photographer. And it's the first time that our papers had a dedicated photographer. And so I think that in other ways, it also gives an opportunity for a paper to be able to take a chance and say, hey, here's something that we haven't had in the past that we think would be a huge benefit to our community. It's not something we could take a risk on otherwise, and it gives them the opportunity to risk and to grow.
So in order to now round out the rest of the context for people, I'd like to touch on some different ownership models, and then some opportunities and what the future might look like there, funding models. So Adam, Nick's paper is owned by Lee Enterprises, which is a huge out-of-state corporation. Lee purchased the Casper Star Tribune in 2002 and currently owns 75 daily newspapers in 26 different states, and more than 350 weekly, classified, and specialty publications. It's the fourth largest newspaper group in the United States. In contrast, I'd like you to talk about the ownership model of the Jackson Hole News and Guide, which is, I guess, what I would describe as the more traditional model for newspapers, but maybe I'm off about that. So how, if you could describe the ownership model there and how it's different from this corporate conglomerate model, and starting there, that would be useful, I think.
Yeah, I'd love to. I've talked a lot about this with folks over the years. I happen to believe that media conglomeration is a really bad thing for the quality of journalism. When you start to prioritize all things underneath the goal of returning the maximum amount of profit to a shareholder, you want to create dividends. That's a very different mission than an organization like ours. We're owned by a family, and that family is in Jackson. And our publisher, Kevin Olson, has been here for 20 years working on, this project. So he is very invested personally. He's raised a family here. And the beauty is, if we have an issue, we walk into his office and we solve the issue. And we're not asking some regional or national, leadership to tell us what to do. So that independence goes a long way. We're very flexible in how we manage things. And I feel like when you take the return to shareholders item off the table, and we still have to be profitable, we run a profitable business. When you take that off the table though, and you can reinvest in different ways into your people and into your community, it changes the game. And I mean, I know Mara works for a family-owned newspaper. I'm sure Mara's got a relationship with Rob, with the publisher. And I think that kind of transaction makes a big difference. And you can look the person in the eye who's a part of the community who says, we need something to change, or here, this is a tough decision we have to make. It's a lot more proximate than having some corporate overlord 1,000 miles away say, cut 2 more, or, do something else. And I think when we go back a couple decades, one of the biggest problems of ownership conglomeration is that you lose this interest in local content. And when you don't have the end of the hall being the owner's office, you get a worse product in my mind. You don't have people in the community saying, oh, well, I know that guy. And the relationship, the trust element is very different when you think of, oh, well, I know the Olsen family, they live in Jackson, and I see him at the, grocery store, versus nobody knows the thousands of Lee Enterprise shareholders personally. There's not that personal connection. So I think that connection goes like between Nick, a reporter, and his source. It's the same thing for a community, a business owner, and the publisher. They're both business operators. That kind of connection makes a lot of impact.
Anyone else want to chime in on this point? Nick, I kind of called your paper out a little bit there. I don't know if you want to respond.
Yeah, well, I mean, listening to Adam talk, reminded me of like so many different things. And I think, the wall that's kind of sits between us and corporate management, largely was one of the reasons that, our newsroom and many other newsrooms around the country decided to unionize. There's this tendency to maybe look at the ledger, especially in like these corporate media offices, and make decisions that way that may work counterproductively to what a newspaper is trying to accomplish. And ultimately, the only way to really get a say in that conversation is to kind of force your way into the door, and I think that's what we tried to do. But yeah, the for-profit model and corporate ownership, at one point was seen as a godsend for a lot of newspapers. I mean, like, let's be real, when people started to cease paying for news and when advertisers discovered that Google existed, a lot of smaller publications simply didn't have the subscriber base or the advertisers they needed to support themselves. So they died. Others were bought up and effectively put on life support. This was basically what happened in my first job. I worked for a Gannett paper, and you get a few good years out of the deal, but then you have to reckon with the perils of working within a publicly traded company. Shareholder value needs to be preserved, profit margins need to be met, and as subscriptions remain tepid and advertisers are harder pressed to buy space in print, those margins become tougher to meet. So how do you meet those margins? You slash overhead, you eliminate your positions, you cut overtime, cut hours, you do whatever you can, hoping the decline in quality doesn't impact how your subscribers feel about paying $120 a year. There are actually hedge funds that bet on this model. They cut as much as they can to max out profitability and hope that they can sustain those profits long enough that they don't lose critical mass of subscribers, that they can't make a ton of money anymore. That's just the model. And yeah, that's designed to work very well in the short term. But if your product sucks, how do you convince new people to pay for it? You can slash the cost of it. You can give them like $1 for a month. But if you have if you profess yourself to be a statewide publication or to be everywhere, and you only have 3 people working there, I mean, eventually they're going to feel cheated. Loyal subscribers are going to feel cheated, and they're not going to want to continue paying for a product that continually gets worse right before their eyes. And a subscription-based media outlet success really does live and die by the loyalty of its audience, and cheating them out of their money doesn't help cultivate that loyalty.
I would add, Nick, that it doesn't add to the advertiser value either, because the traditional model relies in large majority on ad revenue. And the 2 biggest competitors right now are Facebook and Google. So when you look at where local businesses, let's just talk about small local businesses, are spending their money, a lot of them are spending it on social media rather than buying a small ad in the weekly paper like they used to. And so we're constantly challenging our businesses, our customers, and non-customers to invest in the community. You can send your money to global shareholders via Facebook, or you can buy local in your community. And that's what we work so closely with a lot of different business owners and nonprofits to help them reach our audience, which they obviously enjoy because we've got a great content lineup. But it truly takes those two things to be successful. You got to have the audience, you got to have the content, and the revenue. That's the three-legged stool. If you don't have that, something's going to fail.
So, we've been talking about the traditional model here, and so let's start talking about some other forms of revenue or support that have emerged or might emerge. And just for some context, public radio relies on member support and philanthropic donations, has long been, I would say, one of the most successful examples of a nonprofit support structure for news coverage. It might be unique to radio in order to make it work so well, but time will tell. Wildfile has emerged as Wyoming's leading online nonprofit news publication. And there are other opportunities, like we already discussed with Report for America. So first, I'd like to go to, I would like to go to Katie first. Could you talk a little bit about how Wildfile works and how that model works, and how that changes the type of news you cover, and how your news is produced, and quality, and anything else you might want to cover?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because there are more models than just corporate owned or locally owned. So we are online only nonprofit news site. We cover the state. So what that means is we put our content out for free. We deliver it via newsletters and social media, or people can just come to our site. We also make it available to the Wyoming News Exchange, which is a consortium of local newspapers that includes everybody from, I think all of these newspapers are included on it. Not Wyoming Public Radio, it's print, but they can republish any of our stories as long as they credit us at no cost. So in exchange, we have a membership and cultivate donations and run as a nonprofit does. And we don't have a print product that we deliver to people's doorstep every day. But, so many people get their news online anyway, including my father, who read the Casper Star Tribune print for years. Yeah, and so we are sort of, we are held up to the interest of our members, of our readers, and we don't do breaking news. We leave that to the Star Tribune, mainly Nick and Seth. We do more in-depth, thorough type coverage of the news and issues. And we do statewide coverage, and I would like to say too, we're actually a growing organization, but we're still tiny, and it's really difficult to cover the state. And I think the hardest thing about the job is letting so many stories pass us by that are great stories that we just don't have the bandwidth to do. And I also try to strike the balance that Tennessee brought up earlier of, if we're focusing on hyperlocal issues, we can do that as long as they have some kind of statewide implication.
So Tennessee, you also work for a nonprofit news source. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that experience and what you see as benefits, drawbacks, if any, just so we can better understand the difference there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to unpack this statement very much, but I will say that I was raised by two journalists, and one of them was a founding editor of USA Today, and now I work for public radio. So I definitely learned some things about what it's like to do journalism in a profit model, just growing up in newspaper, for-profit newspaper newsrooms. And I was like, yep, not for me. So, I mean, I like the idea of working for public radio, because I think one of the things about public radio that's just interesting to look at is there wasn't a transition the way that for-profit newspapers had to go through a transition. Terrestrial broadcast doesn't have a paywall. We, go out over FM or AM, and anybody with a radio can tune it in. And we've maintained that sensibility. So there's no paywall for our web content, our digital content. And I think one of the things that, I at least feel like it's just figuring out how to take advantage of these multiple platforms and how to really serve and reach as many communities as we possibly can. And I think in doing a good job, it means that we have to intentionally do outreach to communities that are more marginalized, disenfranchised. And I'm speaking specifically about the sort of assumed audience for public radio that is white, and that is middle-aged, and that is wealthy and educated. And so to push beyond that means that we have to go out and ask folks, people of color, low-income people, how can we serve you? You're not listening, but we're public radio. We want to serve you. So what does that look like? And I think that for me is the sort of like the next frontier of feeling like I'm doing a really good job as a journalist, not that just sort of whoever finds me, but that I actually have to find those people and ask them what they need. Because that's my mission. Like, if people don't have access to information, I want to get it to them, and getting them that information is about making our communities safer, healthier, the vitality of democracy. And that's not a thing that's achieved by sort of with one segment of the population. That is like an everyone project. And so, yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. And I feel like there's a lot of potential to do that with public radio, but it does take resources.
I see an interesting parallel between what you were saying and what Adam said earlier. And that's this, underpinning both the Jacksonville News and Guide model and the public radio model is a high quality product. And you said you don't have a paywall, but you kind of do in a sense where because the product is so good, public radio has developed this really devoted group of listeners, people that listen to public radio all the time. It's their main news source. And so then once a quarter or so, those folks who are devoted are kind of held hostage. You're holding back the content that they so love and seek out every day on the radio when you do your pledge drives. And that's that, and it's not the same thing as a paywall, but it works because the quality of the content and the quality of the news you deliver is so good. And Adam was making a similar point. The Jacksonville News and Guide is able to sell advertising in this kind of traditional way, where a lot of folks aren't anymore in their paper, because people are consuming the product still there. Any thoughts on that? Am I stretching with this parallel?
It's all about quality. You're totally right, Chris. I mean, you've got to have the right content that people seek out. And as Tennessee said, you got to know what your audience wants. The thing that I would say differentiates our two industries, well, I guess I would say the kind of three we're talking about. So nonprofit news online, and then nonprofit radio. there's a lot lower cost of production in your particular two categories, Katie and Tennessee. You know, when we talk about what's required to make a newspaper, there's a lot of raw materials. So for example, we've got, once everything gets done being made in a computer, so like basically when Katie would go to click publish on something, we have a whole nother array of steps. So we've got pre-press or reburn aluminum lithograph plates. Those get hung on a press that costs, you know, many hundreds of thousands of dollars years ago. Obviously, it's been well used and well depreciated over time, but very expensive to fix, and it takes a lot of expertise to print. Then it has to get collated. Then it has to go into a vehicle to get distributed. So, you know, the delivery mechanism for a newspaper is much more complicated than clicking publish onto a web platform or over the air, in that there has to be a person bringing that paper in the middle of the night. You know, in our case, it's Jeff or Jayanne or somebody bringing you that paper to the point you pick it up at. So inherently, our business models had more time to mature and more time to establish a higher, I guess, if you will, you know, rate structure, cost per thousand. That's how you buy audience, is really in cost per thousand. And so these newspaper models are declining in the sense that a lot of the advertisers, the legacy advertisers that were comfortable and had budgeted for paying higher cost per thousand overall expenses, so lower cost maybe per end user. You know, for example, I always compare the Super Bowl. You get, you know, $4 million 30-second spot, but you get so many people that it costs way less per impression than a normal eyeball during a, you know, Wednesday night news program. So the efficiencies of newspapers have always been very high, and I think the differences of creating an online versus a print product is, we always talk, it's digital dimes to print dollars. And so if we were to just print only online, publish only online, we would need to significantly reduce our entire operation, reduce beats, just to meet the new level of revenue coming in. And of course, subscriptions or membership. I mean, membership and subscription or donations are all very similar. It's a recurring transaction with the end user saying, I want to pay for this content. And however that works, if it's voluntary or forced, I'm not going to mail you a paper unless you pay. You know, obviously Tennessee's you're going to hear on the air whether you make that donation during the fund drive or not. But in the end, we need the reader or the listener to make a commitment, whether it's with time or with dollars, to what we do. And, you know, just a side note, and this is a sort of a final pitch for newspapers from me, the most engaged news audiences are reading newspapers in print. You're not sitting there with 5 windows open on your, or 500 tabs open like some of us on our computers. You don't have your phone notifying you of the latest, greatest thing your friend posted on Facebook or Instagram. You are totally engaged. You've got that sheet open in front of you and you are immersed in the local news. And that is, I'll stand by, the best experience. I know that I am, you know, better at digesting the news and I read it in print. So the other thing I would say, you know, just to support journalism or to support, you know, what you believe in, you know, when you go to the store that advertises in your local newspaper, say, hey, yeah, I saw your ad in the newspaper. Thanks for, you know, advertising there. I appreciate you supporting journalism in our community. And oh, by the way, I want to buy something from you, because that's the most important transaction in the sustainability of newspapers. Or in the case of the other, you know, ways we get news, the new way of getting news, of course, is online, the modern way. And it's harder to make that connection with a local business if you're online because you're not in person. Maybe you're clicking a link to go buy on Amazon. So I would bring it all back to hyperlocal. Means hyperlocal on the subscription front, on the content front, on the advertising front. That's what makes everything tick.
So we have a couple comments in the chat asking about how to address misinformation and disinformation. But I have to admit I'm torn, because I also want to talk about the future and I want to talk about solutions. And I want to know what you think. Is the future nonprofit for newspapers? Is it the end of newspapers as we know it? Is something else going to emerge? Like, you know, because my proposition to you is we have a problem in that we don't have the capacity for local news coverage that we used to have, that newspapers used to provide. And that slack has not been picked up, you know, for the most part. Wildfile picks up you know, and the investigative piece quite a lot, you know, and they do a great job. But when it comes to just like the kind of the canvassing and the drudgery of day-to-day meetings and all that kind of stuff, we don't have that capacity anymore. So are we going to get that back? And how? And what are solutions here?
Well, I don't know if this is a solution, but there was a fascinating New York Times op-ed in March called "Bailout Journalists Let Newspaper Chains Die." It was by Ben Smith. I don't know if anybody read it. It argued that sort of the pandemic exacerbated an already dire situation for traditional news models, but brought forth an opportunity to make the painful but necessary shift away from for-profit news in favor of nonprofit news models. And programs like Report for America and the American Journalism Project, which, full disclosure, selected Wildfile in its first cohort of grantees. And, you know, I come from a print journalism background. I started in print newspapers. The first paper I worked for has since folded. The second had an editorial team of about 10 when I started, including such unthinkable luxuries as a copy editor and a photo editor. And I think it's down to 5 total, including layout people in its editorial department now. And it was really great work, and it was really important to the readers, and it still is. It's so important to the readers, but it's really unsustainable to try to put a staff through that. So it just creates sort of a self-perpetuating downward cycle when newsrooms are just constantly shrinking. So I think, you know, some evolution is needed in news. It's tough no matter which way you look at it, but I think what Adam said is it's going to mean making investment in the news that you care about and the news that you trust, whatever that is, if it's nonprofit or profit.
And one we didn't even mention is also like stakeholder ownership as well is another option. It could still be for profit, but like Nick, could the Casper Star Tribune be like the Green Bay Packers, where you have a ton of local folks who invest in it and want the product? I mean, is that possible? Or, you know, you can address something else as well, Nick.
I mean, I think that could be like a viable path forward if we are going to continue with the subscription model, because I think like the types of outlets that you see that are succeeding nowadays, you know, Wildfile, for example, back in the last city I lived in, the Ithaca Voice has filled a really valuable void where the local Gannett paper has abdicated that role. You know, examples are everywhere: MinPost, Texas Tribune, VT Digger. I mean, they're all doing great work in a vacuum that's kind of been left behind by traditional news outlets. But I guess like when we're relying on that to be the answer, I mean, you know, we're also sort of going towards some place that really is an inherently unequitable model. I mean, you know, under there you go where the money is, or you go where the nonprofits are that can support you with grant money, or you go to a place where you have a large enough locus of supporters that could actually, you know, support you, you know, to give you money. And I guess if we want to support like the current paradigm, you know, I think we really have to ask ourselves some really existential questions about I think too, like the role of government and private business. I mean, are we going to have the FTC put a, you know, heavier hand on media mergers, or we're going to see increasing scrutiny on those? Are we going to, you know, see communities consider the value of local ownership models, or even consider public options? Do media outlets even want that? And is Congress ultimately going to make up its mind about the role of digital conglomerates like Facebook and Google in our democracy? I mean, you can fight back against Amazon by shopping at your local bookstore, or heading downtown and spending your money there. But how do you fight for a share of the digital advertising when Google and Facebook dominate that scene? You know, that's the source of outlet for most news outlets I know. Even large outlets don't get by on subscriptions alone, and their market share is minuscule compared to what these guys demand. And, you know, companies they thrive off of what we produce, and we don't really get any of it. Facebook made a lot of headlines for giving newspapers $100,000 grants to cultivate community, but is that sustainable when we don't really have a sustainable solution to our own revenues? And yeah, that's tough. Like I just keep thinking, like, if we don't find a solution to maybe adapt to the subscription paradigm or create a more equitable environment for local small communities to have news outlets that they deserve, we are going to lose local news. That requires some sort of intervention or community investment.
In the final minute here, this is your last opportunity, panelists, to tell us what the futures should look like here and what the solutions are. Tennessee?
Well, one thing that I think a lot about, and maybe this is a potential solution, but if we see ourselves as public servants and, this idea of the fourth estate, that we are a part of the vitality of this democracy and we play an important role, one of the things that's been really inspiring to me, particularly about working in Wyoming, and maybe listeners and readers don't know this, but many of the journalists in this state, we talk to each other. We collaborate, we cooperate, we acknowledge where the holes are, we try and fill them. We're like sort of like this soccer team where it's like, all right, you're not doing that, I will. And that spirit that is much more cooperative than instead of competitive, I also think is very important to the future of journalism, and particularly local reporting. So that is a really heartening thing. And I love being a part of this journalism community in this state.
And with that, we are out of time. So I will hand it over to Anna. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, panelists.
Yeah, thanks for joining the People's Review. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on our website or by mailing a check to 419 South 5th Street, Laramie, Wyoming. And if you want to sponsor the series, please let us know. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, use the web address that I will drop in the chat here soon. And thanks again for joining us. A couple more things. Please remember, check your voter registration, make sure you're registered, and make a plan to vote. We've also dropped some voting resources in the chat and all of, I believe, the links to membership of all of the news sources that have joined us today. So thanks, everyone.